Hello, my name's Professor Paul Coulton and I'm the Chair of Speculative and Game Design at Lancaster University in the UK. This talk's called Alien Futuring: Speculative Approaches to More Than Human Design, and in many respects challenges human-centered design into becoming more inclusive to include both human and non-human actors within that process. Before I start any talk on the future, I always issue essentially a warning in that in design we also defuture as much as we future. And the philosopher Tony Fry says fundamentally we act to defuture because we do not understand how the values, knowledge, words and things we create go on designing after we have designed them. In essence, many of the problems we see today around climate change are due to the things we've designed and the resources used. So if we don't understand the implications of the designs we do, we can't adequately design to change those problems that we've ultimately created. It does, however, offer us a word of hope by the creation of a perpetual shift so that meaning of one's world and actions alter one's being in the world and the nature of the world to others. In other words, we can create alternative views of the future that will hopefully influence what we perceive is needed in the future to go forward. In terms of futures themselves, they're often started from this futures cone by the physicist Joseph Foros, who's now a predominant futurist. And while this looks beguiling in its simplicity, in that it offers you a movement from time in the present to the future, and then the cones essentially indicate the probability of something happening. So very close, the middle cone is probable, things that are likely to happen. Plausible is the next, with things that could happen, and possible that might happen. There's also this other cone within there called preferable, and that can exist within any of the codes, and is often the preference of the designs you're creating, which in itself can be problematic. Well, as I say, this looks quite beguiling. It's also problematic for a number of reasons I'll go into now. The first, that takes no notion of history. The philosopher Marshall McLuhan says we look to the present through a rear view mirror. We march backwards into the future. In other words, often our view of the future is based on what we understand that from our own experience. So it depends on the past. And taking the past out ignores that the past isn't the same for everybody. We've all experienced the world differently. And by not including that, it creates a one world view almost of what the present is, and whereas actually the present is a contested space. In terms of time, it assumes that everything moves at a similar pace, and this pace layer diagram by Stuart Brand shows how that difference after some things move very fast, and often this is the area of turbulence around where things fast innovate. So you can think of fashion is moving very fast and quickly, then commerce, business runs below that. Infrastructure is much slower to change. Governance is often even slower, and nature itself is very slow to change and takes time to adapt. So this is why we have a problem with net zero, in essence, that we can change what we do very quickly, but it will take a long time to recover for the actions that we've already taken. So things in any system don't work at the same speed, and it's important to think about that when we're innovating around futures in terms of how long things will realistically take, how long does time work for each bit of the system. And we are talking about huge systems now, not individual products and services more often. In terms of the other aspects of this that it doesn't think is, it doesn't take account that of our own personal experiences, the past experience, the environment, what social norms they are, cultural context, Things that might be acceptable in one country might not be another, and personal values and beliefs. In other words, we all see the future differently, the same as we see the present differently. So that actually we don't all necessarily want the same future or are moving to the same ends. And in some ways, we need to incorporate this plurality of views within our futuring to make it more effective. The other aspect that he doesn't cover is the notion of fiction, um, in that we are influences by things that are real, but also things that are also fictional. The example on the left is from Disney, which shows cats drinking milk, and you get lots of people thinking that cats drink milk and putting milk out for the kittens, when most cats are actually lactose intolerant and milk is really bad for them. So this notion that this image has created this worldview um, shows you that fiction can also play a dominant part. And we're seeing that around the discussions of AI, as most of us have seen kind of sci-fi movies such as Terminator. We're very much preoccupied by this kind of robotic future of AI rather than the more mundane aspects of what it's doing in terms of facial recognition, changing the way that we might write in universities, because there are now things that can write essays for us. So it's this notion that fiction doesn't have an influence seems missing from that thing. And to highlight this, the figure on the right is from the Bel Geddes Futurama exhibition from the 1938 World's Fair, where he created this kind of view of a future American city that was very much dominated by cars. It had straight highways and wide roads and very few pavements, and it presented a world of dominated by the car. It's perhaps unsurprising as this um, view of the future was sponsored in its creation by General Motors, and so they were very much interested in a car, a future orientated around the car, as they were car manufacturers. And in finishing this kind of particular side, I'll cover a quote by William and Dorothy Swain Thomas. If people define situations as real, they're real in the consequences. In other words, what we believe has a profound effect on the way we behave towards the future, even those beliefs might be misguided or not based in fact. And we're seeing that with the prevalence around fake news and conspiracy theories. People really believe in these, so they have powerful consequences. And I come back to that notion of preferable to who? Who do you incorporate in this shaping the future? Is it through the corporate visions we perhaps had with Futurama? Or is it tech developers in certain parts of the world who create these systems and deliver them en masse to the world without really thinking through, will these produce a preferable future for all? Are they futures that we really want? Um, and also, it doesn't include the non-human actors. It assumes that humans are the center of everything. And given the problems we're having around climate change and the biosphere, we're losing animals and flora and fauna at alarming rates. The notion that everything should be around the user or individual user is also increasingly problematic. And I turn to the kind of philosopher, game programmer Ian Bogost, who talks about alien phenomenology, or what it's like to be a thing, and that kind of influences the title of the talk, in that we have to think of futures that don't just include us as humans, but also the planet and the biosphere are important actants if we're actually to stop defuturing, in the terms that perhaps Tony Fiber put it. And to think about this, I've created this kind of ontography as an example. So in it, we're having dog drones delivering packages for users, and it's the type of thing that you see in kind of popular science fictions. The dogs themselves might be delivered to the environment through little trucks. In terms of a normal unit-centered perspective, we would perhaps concentrate on the circle around the human. They link to the web, they link to the drone, and the rest of the system was largely obfuscated. But if we think about um, the environment as which is on the far left as expected, we might think about what forces this system created, how much energy it uses, which is increasingly a problem for large AI systems who consume large amounts of electricity and often water for cooling. They require logistics to ship them around the world. So we have to think not just of what it's like for the users who might experience the delivery system, but what about the role of the larger system and its effects on the environment by adopting these alternate perspectives. And so I come to this notion of alien futuring, which is an alternative to the future cone. And the idea is it supports a world in which many worlds can fit. In other words, we're not driving one dominant vision, but trying to incorporate all the different visions that might exist in world and to come to some sort of consensus or way in which all these visions can live together. So it talks really about a creative presence which is influenced by our history, our realities, our beliefs, our values, and fictions. And that future then can be taken from different individuals. It can also think about futures related to algorithms, which increasingly we may have to think about with the role of AI and data, or the biosphere and the planet. Those particular futures might be different for those individuals. So how do we incorporate those within our design process or our design practice such that we create a more equitable view of the future? And also, what types of future visions do we create? And I'm inspired by this quote by Bell Hooks: to be a true visionary, we need to root our imagination in our concrete reality while simultaneously imagining possibilities that are beyond reality. And in some ways, that echoes with the Marshall McLuhan quote, in that it's anchoring things within people's current lived experience, but also making them fantastical or different from that experience. But in order to make them more believable, they have to have some hook within what people might currently understand. And I often call these more mundane futures, in that we're not trying to create these fantastical realms, but anchoring things into how they become domesticated or an everyday component of our life. And that's what this next slide is trying to indicate, in that on the left we take things like patents, prototypes or science fiction that displays some emerging technology, and then influenced by our histories, reality, beliefs and values and fictions in the present, we can create new design fictions that are represent future worlds in which these emerging technologies have become domesticated. In other words, how might we use them in our everyday lives? Which all sounds very good in theory, but how do we put this in practice? Um, and as an example, I'm going to present some work that we've been doing around the future of repair, and certainly in Europe, there's been a big push towards the right to repair, in that making devices last longer, so moving away from a throwaway culture. And the reasons behind that are that e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream in the world, and currently we only have 15 or 20% of that recycled, and then in a lot of cases much lower. and that represents about 53 million tons of waste are produced each year, which is the equivalent to about 350 cruise ships worth of electronics. And it's only growing bigger. And so if we create lots of um, unrepairable items, most of this is ending up in landfill. So how do we make repair going forward? And whilst we can say, oh, we'll make it easy for people to do their own repair, there's a questionable of whether we'll actually have the skills or the capacity to repair. So it's all very well giving people a right to do something, but if they're not able to enact that right, it becomes somewhat meaningless. So in terms of a fiction and thinking about AI and data, we thought, why would it be the humans who are responsible for the repair? Why not make it the responsibility of um, the devices themselves? If we're adding more and more computing power and potentially AI to these things, perhaps the time is to hand over some of the responsibility to that. And so, thinking about kind of as Asimov's three rights of robotics, we came up with um, three rights of repair for that would be enacted by an AI device operating itself. So the first right would be to sustain its own existence as long as that action doesn't negatively impact on the first sustainability. So in other words, when we create something or it repairs itself, it should do so in a way that doesn't create more damage to the environment than the resources that it may already have taken. The second right is to sustain the existence of fellow augmented things as long as that action doesn't conflict with the first right. In other words, there could be an overall AI that controlled maybe all the items in your household and looked after them and decided whether you would things need to repair and managed in a way that sustain them. So it's thinking about repair as a service almost that you could take on board and use within these environments. And finally, is the last right to end its existence, so long as that action doesn't negatively impact on the Earth's sustainability or the existence of fellow augmented things. In other words, if we um, want to no longer support a thing, does that mean that a lot of the services that went with it are no longer supported? Or do we have ways that things can be disposed of in a more equitable and resilient way? In other words, do we need to be able to make the parts so they're easily recycled? The precious minerals often go in these devices reused. So we can make the products and services themselves manage it, both their from cradle to grave and be recycled. So it's taking a kind of circular economy view of these things. In terms of what these may look like, we've chosen a kind of very simple example of a toothbrush that might have AI built into it and made with these three rights. And this is a kind of fictitious example of what that toothbrush might be. So you might think of it almost like a digital twin, in that you have services online that monitor the toothbrush and things, seeing whether the bristles are still effective and the battery's charging properly, and all these things that might detect malfunction. So it's all part of this notion of how long things take to repair in the future. And then the last right would be to think how it's disposed of. And you might think of hardware and software having different disposal cycles. Often it's much easier to replace the hardware the software than it is to replace the hardware. So we have to think about whether we have different repair and maintenance schedules and different life cycles for these different elements of the thing. So in terms of speculative design and speculative futures. What I'm proposing is a way of thinking about futures that don't just prioritize our human interests, but also the interests of the planet, of devices, of algorithms, whatever that might be. So we can take on board the fact that we're not producing things that are very much aimed at an individual. They have larger systemic effects on the world. And as designers, we need to take a more systemic approach to what we're doing in the world and really combat some of the defuturing effects that we've had in the past. Okay, so that's the end of this presentation. I hope you found it interesting and useful. Thank you. Bye bye.